Welcome back to the Shaw Consulting Social Housing Technology Podcast. In this episode, we're continuing our conversation of cyber resilience in social housing, focusing on what happens when an incident occurs and how organisations respond, recover and learn. I'm your host, Stuart, and today I'm joined again by Ian Whitwell, Shaw Consulting's Associate Director of Cyber Assurance. Hi, Ian.
Hi, Stuart.
Let's start with business continuity planning. Most organisations will say they have a plan in place, but how confident should they be that it would actually work in a live cyber incident? Ian?
Well, I think, to quote what I regard as a great boxer, as Mike Tyson famously said, anyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. That's the key, really. You think you've got a plan, but is it actually going to work? So I think realistically, that plan needs regular, realistic testing, both as a desktop exercise and real life situation. And you can use that then to properly assess its viability and robustness. And obviously, any issues that you've picked up in that testing can then be addressed to ensure in a real life situation that all stakeholders know what to expect and act accordingly.
Reassure me there's no fists involved in these real life situations.
Hopefully not, no.
Good. Okay, so what are the common gaps you see when you start to test these plans?
I think it's the obvious things, really. The plan is out of date. It doesn't have clear lines of control, poor communication. The key players don't understand who does what and when, potential lack of playbooks for the operational teams, and what are the workarounds in the event of an incident.
Okay, so we've touched on this before, actually, Ian, in our previous podcasts. How do you make sure a business continuity plan is something that's lived and breathed rather than just a document put on a shelf to gather dust?
I think it's just got to be testing. Ideally, you should be doing a realistic test at least once a year involving all the key players and their deputies.
So when plans are tested, what tends to surprise organisations the most?
Probably how quickly it starts to fall apart.
Wow.
I think, that's often what, I've seen. I recently attended a cyber attack simulation exercise organised by a major cyber insurer. And I spoke to several organisations that had actually experienced real life cyber attacks. And the common message was that the plan was often quickly ditched or substantially changed, and the incident required the response team to quickly devise new solutions to address and resolve the issues raised.
There's very much decision making under high pressure.
Absolutely.
So during a live cyber incident, decisions, as you just said, have to be made really quickly and with incomplete information. How prepared are leadership teams for that in reality?
Well, from my own and others' experience I spoke to, you don't realise that pressure until you experience it. So I think you need to give a realistic scenario simulation, which includes putting those key players under time pressure to respond.
So what are the most difficult decisions organisations face during a live attack?
I think on that initial assessment, when you understand that you've got a cyber attack taking place potentially, taking that necessary action to limit the impact of the attack as quickly as possible. And that can involve taking down key systems quickly and potentially causing operational inconvenience whilst the true extent of the incident is assessed. When is the correct time to involve outside agencies to assist in investigating the incident and planning the correct remediation? When to actually invoke the business continuity plan itself? And then, to put it mildly, the $64,000 question, whether to pay a ransom or not if you've actually been asked for a ransom.
That is a big, big question and a big decision. I'm not sure we're going to answer that today.
No, we're not.
So just moving on, data. Social housing sector is always talking about this. In particular, we'll just briefly talk about data and the supply chain risk. So how confident are organisations in knowing what data they hold, where it sits and how exposed it is?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Knowing where your information is, where your key assets are is key. And so for that, you should be really maintaining an information asset register, that you keep it up to date. And it's particularly focused on those key data sets. And then making sure you know who owns each data set. This needs to be each relevant operational team, certainly not IT. And also, you've got a map of each system, its data and its information flow, so that you can see that in the event of a cyber attack, you would know, okay, what's impacted by that potential breach.
Is data governance still an overlooked part of cyber resilience?
I think so, yes. Have you correctly classified your data? Is there appropriate protection in place to prevent unauthorized access? And I think together with measures to spot potential breaches of policy, example is sensitive data leaving the organization, and is it being prevented?
So it sort of brings me on a bit to the supply chain. So if a key contractor or supplier is compromised, how quickly would most organizations know and what would they actually be able to do about it?
Well, it depends on what the supplier's supplying, but it's not always easy. It's probably staff training again. Awareness is key here, together with security measures to spot potential unusual behaviour patterns. And then, if a contractual supplier breach is known, then there's a need to take appropriate measures to prevent this becoming a direct issue for the organisation. For example, how quickly can you close down access for the supplier to the organisation's network? Stopping email communications, even at that level. And then, being able to assess what impact has the supplier breach already caused? Could customer data have been compromised? Because ultimately, it's the organization's responsibility for any data that is compromised by their contractor or supplier.
Okay, thanks very much for that. So just sort of moving on, two things I just scribbled down, trade-offs and real-world pressures, just to describe the next couple of questions. So, housing organizations are under constant financial and operational pressure. How do you balance investment in cyber resilience against competing priorities like the housing development, repairs and services?
I think it's important to justify it in the same way you justify any business investment decision. So you need to evidence what is that cybersecurity giving you, benefits it provides to the organization, and then for new or continued investment, can this be justified or not? Using that standard commercial criteria. For example, I actually provided a table to our board showing the annual investment in cybersecurity and the purpose of each benefit of each of those investments. And this also included, the potential new investments for consideration as part of our annual planning process. Again, it's a decision to be made and looking at the risk versus the reward.
Where do organizations tend to underinvest or take risks without fully realizing it?
I think, you've got to realize that cyber attacks don't just happen instantly. The commonly accepted timeline from a successful breach of an organizational security to an attack taking place is measured in weeks and months. So I think given this, a key area that I've focused on was systems to spot potential breaches and unusual patterns of behavior within the network, so-called managed detection and response systems, and combining that with an external 24/7 security operations center, which I consider was worth its weight in gold. And that any incidents that are reported by that operations center are reviewed on a daily basis and actioned. And these systems aren't cheap. So I think they require a strong business case and evidence of successful use when implemented. Maybe using that as I know we certainly did use it as a pilot. So we did a pilot implementation and that gave us loads of really good justification for the actual investment that I then put to the exec team, which was accepted.
Excellent. So that sort of leads me on really to learning from incidents and near misses. When an incident or a near miss does occur, how well do organizations typically learn from them?
Well, I think it's obviously important to maintain a register of all cyber incidents and together with a root cause analysis and lessons learned log from that incident. Also, what measures are being taken to prevent a repeat of the incident. And I think, again, it's important to communicate these incidents to staff in a non blame culture way to show that the organisation is taking these incidents seriously and learning the lessons from those potential incidents.
For this next question, we have touched on this slightly before in previous podcasts. What should leaders in social housing be doing to create an environment where issues are reported early and openly?
Yeah, I think key is that no blame culture, otherwise people just won't report these incidents. And make sure you train staff how to spot incidents and how to report them, ideally quickly and easily to do as well. So not a burden on busy staff day job. Encourage reporting, even if it turns out to be a false positive. Encourage it. Publicising incidents and reporting and show how important this is.
So I'm guessing testing and readiness is a really important part of this process. How often should organizations realistically be testing their incident response and business continuity plans?
Yeah, I think as I've touched on previously, it's got to be as a minimum on an annual basis, with potential mini tests of response playbooks more frequently as a team exercise to the relevant department. Back to that idea of what would you do if you lost your key business system that you rely on? What's your workaround? How would you manage? And if well done, these won't just be just a cold test. It'll be interesting and thought provoking for the participants rather than a chore to be endured.
I guess some organizations may try and opt for a basic test, but they probably need something that genuinely challenges the organization. What would be the difference between, say, a basic and a challenging test?
Yeah, I think a basic test would probably be a short desktop test, maybe appropriate for testing of the incident response plan and the relevant playbooks with a few key participants. Whereas the challenging test is going to be a full test of the business continuity plan, either the desktop test involving all key participants or a simulation of an incident over a few hours.
So for organizations listening to this now and thinking they need to strengthen their approach, what do you think are the most important practical steps they should be taking right now?
I think you need to look at what you're doing. So I think you need to examine your existing approach to cybersecurity and assurance. Ask the question, are you confident that you understand the reports and assurances given and that the evidence supports the assurance? Examine your business continuity plan and the incident response plans. Do they look comprehensive? Are they robust? When was the last time you tested these plans? What was the result? Is it time for a retest?
And where do organizations most often underestimate their risk or overestimate their readiness?
I think, perhaps just harking back a little bit to maybe that complacency bit. So thinking that just because you've invested a lot of money in cybersecurity, a successful attack can't happen. All organizations have large and complex networks of IT systems. An attacker, unfortunately, only needs to be lucky once in finding a vulnerability to exploit. The organization needs to be lucky all the time.
Because we don't want to worry our listeners, do we, Ian? Because I think you've probably set out in the last couple of podcasts some quite clear strategies for anyone who feels they're unprepared for this. So, final question. If you had one message for boards and exec teams in social housing and cyber resilience, what would it be?
I think it would be to adopt a posture of when, not if, a cyber attack will happen. There's no such thing as standing still in cybersecurity. You're either moving forwards or backwards, touched on that. And it's just most true in the world of cybersecurity. New areas of attack are appearing daily, especially, as I've said, now with artificial intelligence being deployed to discover and exploit vulnerabilities. That timeline between a successful breach happening and attack happening is being shortened because of that.
Ian, thanks again for your time. That's all for this episode of the Shaw Consulting Social Housing Technology Podcast. If you'd like to find out more about cyber assurance and resilience, you can contact Chris Shaw or Ian via LinkedIn. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.